you're ready, you can look at the camera and then tell us about today.
Hi, my name is Danielle Troetti, and I'm at Bethel Middle School in Bethel, Connecticut.
Let me cut you really quick, sorry. I'm getting outside audio. Okay. Go for it, sorry.
Hi, I'm Danielle Troetti, and I teach at Bethel Middle School in Bethel, Connecticut. And today I taught a lesson in an 8th grade class on questioning to better understand text and to collaborate with peers to revise questioning and to further analyze text.
Okay, good. Do you want me to go right into some of the questions?
Sure.
Okay. We want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. How does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it?
This lesson is a continuation of a series of lessons to kick off Unit 3. Our focus for Unit 3 is the essential question, how does an author's presentation of information affect one's understanding of history? And so to model and to practice, we are looking at 2 poems, I Hear America Singing by Langston Hughes, by Walt Whitman, and I Too Sing America by Langston Hughes. And we're looking at how both poets address the American ideal of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we are furthering our reading skills and our analysis skills. Students have been making annotations on text and starting to run their own discussions, but they tend to ask somewhat literal questions. So this series of lessons is built around having them take their annotations and develop them into critical questions that they can use to run their own academic discourse about a text and develop a broader understanding of a concept.
Is the text used in this lesson part of the sequence of texts designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, please give an example of other texts that form this sequence.
Yes, so I spoke about how these 2 poems are paired together, and there are differences in the author's perspectives and some of the topics around the American ideal, but both authors are one is out and out joyous, hopeful for America and the American ideals, and the other has a negative perspective but with hope at the end. So we will continue with another Langston Hughes text after this that actually has less of a hopeful or optimistic outview or outlook, so that students can examine that from another perspective. And then we have multiple other series of texts within the unit where students can analyze the text, to go back and write, think, talk about how the author's presentation of information affects how we understand either a particular historical time period, concept, or figure in history, and then eventually they'll be choosing their own event or topic to research from multiple perspectives and to see how the author's different presentations and viewpoints affect our understanding of a concept.
Talk about the standards targeted in the lesson. What do you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of the standard?
There were 2 sets of standards for the lesson. One were the reading standards, which was reading, literature, grade 8, standard 2, dealing more with the theme part as we were looking at author's message, and then standard 4, looking at specific words, language within a poem and really ripping it apart to see how it impacts the message, perspective, purpose, or the student's understanding of those things as a whole. And so their annotations, their questioning, their rereading, all are aimed at achieving proficiency with those standards. And then the other part with the speaking and listening skills that they have been focusing on and we're continuing to work on as far as what good academic discourse or conversation looks like. And specifically here we're looking at speaking and listening, grade 8, standard 1, A, and C. In their preparation, they're thinking about material, but then also how they are posing questions of the text and of each other to come to a deeper understanding.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies and why?
Core action 1, I think is a given just because the text is a typical grade 8 text as far as lexile and also some of the content presented. Langston Hughes's language, his structure, his punctuation, the way he organizes the poem, I think, all addressing what could be seen as something negative, but still maintaining a hopeful tone within it. I think that that is fairly complex for students to rip apart, and the fact that it contributes to the larger concept and how it connects to I Hear America Singing, and then both of those being used in context to answer the larger unit's essential question. I think that all of that is fairly complex. However, it's clearly text dependent, appealing to or meeting the needs of core action 2, in that the whole lesson is built around the student's own understanding of text, how they ask questions of text, and how they use the text to lead their own discussion to better understand a concept. I address core action 3 somewhat in that everybody was responsible within the conversations, and they were grouped accordingly to maximize the benefit of conversation, but I also had question stems for the students who were struggling with questioning to help them see how they could use their annotations to ask either higher order questions, more text-specific questions, or more open-ended questions.
Good. We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS. Hold on, let me do one thing. Pause. We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
I think the focus, having students ask their own questions of the text, really focuses on how they have to dig into the academic language of the text in particular. It was interesting in the groups to see how students were interpreting Langston Hughes's term darker brother. I guess as an adult with my prior knowledge, it's just so obvious what he's addressing. And some of the students were rooted in the text, and they were coming up with their own interpretations based on their background knowledge. But it was interesting to hear some of them talk about somebody being in the shadows from the Holocaust, or being an alienated family member who was not allowed to sit at the table. So really having them look at some of the language that Langston Hughes uses and the context around it, and some of them needed to do some inquiry to better understand that academic language, is partially addresses one of the shifts. It is literary and not nonfiction, but the students will have to access informational text to help them better understand the poem. As a matter of fact, some of them asked me during their group work, what race is Langston Hughes, when did he live, how old is he, and I complimented them on their understanding that they needed some inquiry, and I directed them to use technology. So some of them were doing a little bit of research to help them better understand, so that they did turn to informational text to help make sense of the literary text. In addition, as far as the text dependency, I think that, again, because the whole lesson was based around their making meaning of the text independently and collaboratively, and it was all centered around, the entire lesson was focused on the poem, I think that really reflects the text dependency.
How did you teach the content of this lesson or this text prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
I think prior to the CCSS, I would have given in to my desire to talk about maybe Langston Hughes's time period or background knowledge, supply the background knowledge about Langston Hughes or the Harlem Renaissance before reading the poem. And I probably would have done the same thing with the poem that we read before, which was I Hear America Singing. And I would have front-loaded too much. At this point, I think I controlled that by letting them use technology and letting them ask those questions, but the students determined when they needed that information and how they needed it. Based on some of the things people were talking about, I might clue them in to the fact that some of them need to do that research or provide that direct instruction when it's appropriate, but I did not front load it, which I may have done prior to CCSS.
Student engagement is crucial to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. How did you support all students in working with grade level texts? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
One of the supports that I provided prior to the lesson, students had access to the poem prior to using it in the day's lesson. I also provided via Google Drive links to video of Langston Hughes reading his poem and with images to support understanding of some of the concepts possibly or the themes brought up in the poem. So some of the students had access to that even prior to coming into class discussion. In addition, some of the students had support either with their annotations, or I had question stems to provide for students who had annotations that reflected thinking and some understanding in the text, but they just didn't know how to turn it into a question or what they should do with the information. I had some open-ended questions that kind of modeled generally, if you noticed a literary device, what are some types of questions you could ask about it? And so I left them a question stem where they could just fill in the blank with the literary device or the author's message and things like that, so that I could help them figure out what they should do with the information that they had and with the thinking they had already done on their own.
And then what did you do for students that are above grade level text?
For the students who are above grade level text, I tried to prompt them to look at the connections beyond just the text itself. There are some parts of the text, as far as the punctuation or the sentence structure, one word on a line. As I was going around, I tried to ask those students to really focus on those aspects of the poem, which not everybody noticed. A lot of the things that everybody noticed were the more obvious pieces. The fact that there was a person sitting in a different room, not allowed to eat with everybody else, that he's referred to as the darker brother. So a lot of questions focused around that. But the timing aspect of the author's structure, which I think is a more complex piece, is what I tried to direct some students' attention to, because they understood through their discussion, through their annotations, through their questions, I could see that they understood the more obvious pieces of the poem.
How did you know students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
Some of them did, some of them did not. I have formative assessments. I have the students' annotations on the poems, I have the questions that they wrote, and I have the written feedback that they offered each other to review before I see them again, to see how each student did specifically. But in general, I have a sense of who got it and who did not based on the notes that I was taking as I went around to each group, who was struggling, who had questions that reflected understanding of the text, and who had information, who understood the text. And so there were groups of students, some who understood the text but weren't really taking the next step to be able to ask questions. There were students who didn't understand the text really, and then there were students who were competent at both, who were ready to move to the next level. So I have that general sense based on the conversations, and then I have the specific written evidence for me to go back and review before I see them next.
Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson, and what actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
I think their conversations, in some groups especially, really demonstrated their independence. They were giving each other feedback and asking each other for feedback without my prompting. They were coming up with the lesson was designed to have them work independently on questions, but in some of the groups where they had a series of steps, and they had skipped past the revision and rewriting of their questions because they immediately jumped into the discussion and the wanting to answer their questions. So even though they weren't following directions exactly, and I still needed them to do that because I needed to see where they were with that skill, to see how they met the objective, I was also pleased by the fact that they were taking on that independence and that desire to try to figure out what the poem meant and to answer the questions they were coming up with, which really is the big goal in and of itself, is that's what we want.
Okay, so last two questions. Great instructors are continuously learning. We want to understand what you celebrated in this lesson and what you would improve upon. Reflecting on the lesson today, what worked particularly well and what might you do differently?
I think having the criteria and the models prior to today and having the time to really think about that and go through that were good things for the students. I think that I may have divided them so that they really were forced to work in their pairs. I think they just naturally, in the foursums, go back to talking as a whole group, and I think that some people then get lost. Some people didn't get as much feedback as others. I think it was harder for them to follow the process that I had set up in some cases, not in all. But so I may have structured that a little bit different. There were also some students who I found were better at helping each other. So I think I would probably go back and look at my data to see which students I would pair with whom. I thought I had done that strategically. I think I might actually readdress my strategy a little bit.
Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
For the most part, I think things went the way I expected. There was one student who said that he didn't understand, he didn't know how to write a question, and I know from class he asks great questions, so I was very surprised by that. And I actually think that in his case, the very explicit instruction and the specifically worded criteria points actually confused the issue for him. So when I asked him, if you're going to discuss this, what would you ask? Let me see the questions you asked. They were great questions. They were exactly what I was looking for. They were interesting. They were just natural and authentic. And so I was surprised that he didn't think he understood. And that would also probably be something that I would revise to see for the kids who I know are just authentically and naturally asking really good questions, how I might differentiate the lesson for them as maybe a separate group the next time I do this lesson.
You're done. Thank you.